Just in a few moments, you're going to hear from someone who turned his wish into change and reduced the wait times in his region of Nova Scotia. So I'm just going to turn it over to Sue Haley, who's going to properly introduce our guest speaker.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. It's my pleasure to be introducing Todd Leader. Todd is a registered psychologist and a registered social worker who has spent the last 26 years working as a transformational leader in health services and in health promotion, particularly in the areas of mental health, addiction, and primary health care. He has also been teaching in the Faculty of Science at St. Mary's University for the same 26 years. Todd has earned the Excellence in Teaching Award from the St. Mary's University Students Association. As well, health services under his leadership have earned 2 International Best Practice Awards and a Leadership Award for Excellence in Women's Health. Most recently, he was appointed by the Nova Scotia Minister of Health and Wellness to the Ministerial Advisory Panel on Innovation in Mental Health and Addictions. Todd has been the president of the Public Health Association of Nova Scotia, a member of the Board of Directors of the Canadian Public Health Association, and is currently the president-elect of the Association of Psychologists of Nova Scotia. Todd has spent his whole career working as an advocate for client-centered health services and evidence-based healthy public policy. His most recent accomplishment is that he has written a book called It's Not About Us, The Secret to Transforming the Mental Health and Addiction System in Canada. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Todd Leader.
Well, I'm disappointed, Sue, because that wasn't the introduction I asked you to do.
Yes, because here's why I used to go to Scotia.
Exactly. All that other stuff just it misleads you because it makes you think that I know shit. That's really bad. Because it sets the bar here and I'm going to be way the hell down here. Okay. I'll try not to bore you to death. I know a number of people here have already read the book, so some of this will be repetitious, but we'll see how it goes. So I want to start off by putting in a couple of somewhat disclaimers, I guess, just so you understand the context of the intention of this book. And I've said it in the book that I don't intend this book to be a description of a model. I don't want to see any program or any organization take this book and say, okay, well, this is the model we need. And if you find yourself using that word, then you've misunderstood the book. Because I believe, frankly, that implementing a model of service is counter to client-centered service. Because it implies a level of standardization. And I believe standardization is actually the enemy of client-centeredness. Standardization is the program equivalent of a one-size-fits-all t-shirt. How does that work for you? Is there such a thing? Put up your hand if a one-size-fits-all t-shirt actually is the right size for you. Please put your hand up if that is the case. Yeah, so, and in programs and services, particularly around something that is as complex as mental health and addictions, and in fact most of healthcare, the concept of creating one specific model where everything works a certain way, no matter who comes in the door, no matter what community you're in, that concept is actually, it's flawed logic. Now, I'm not saying we don't need to have some level of equity, of availability of services, and I'm not saying we shouldn't have some predictable kinds of processes, but everything we do, if we truly mean client-centered, or person-centered, or patient-centered. I use client, but you can replace those with whichever one you like. If we truly mean it, then we have to make sure that everything we do is adaptable and responsive, which is hard for administrators. It's easier for clinicians, I find, because clinicians are used to adapting their every word, their every interaction with a client, with a patient. They're used to adapting to that person in the moment. Is that accurate from a clinical perspective? That is what you do, in fact. there's no such thing as one size fits all at the clinical level. So the concept of client-centered, when we think about that term, we normally gravitate to that patient care level. You know, we think of Carl Rogers, we think of the concept of, you know, the patient or the client and how we provide care to them in that setting. But at an administrative level, I believe that we have simply never thought about whether or not administration is applicable to the concept of client-centeredness. And that's what this book is about. It's about trying to kind of point out that the decisions made by the least important people in the system, so me and Sue, and no offense to, but the least important people in the system are the administrators, except for the fact that we set the culture, that we set the one-size-fits-all crap. We set the permission for people to adapt to clients and break the rules. That's where we're important. We're not important in any other way, except that we can make a system rigid and completely unresponsive to clients, or we can make it client-centered. We can give permission or take it away for staff to actually be flexible and responsive and do things differently for one client than another and not worry that it's unequal, that it's not the same. That's where our power is, but that's also where our weakness is, historically speaking. That's the part that I believe needs to change. That's what this book was really about, was how do we take that part of our system, not the client care. Let's assume all that is great. Let's assume, even those who know people like right, let's assume that the people from clinical backgrounds, that they do good work, right? It was a joke, in case you didn't know. I'm smart enough, so I'll criticize for anybody I met so far. So, but let's assume the clinical stuff is happening, and that's a whole separate issue. That's not what this is about. I'm not a clinician. I'm a registered psychologist and registered social worker, but I'm not clinically trained. I'm a community psychologist, which really is focused on population, not individuals, and focused on systems, focused on the way the environment and the systems affect people and their health and their experiences. So that's really where my head lives. And for that reason, I expect that anybody from a clinical perspective who has read the book has probably disagreed with some of the stuff in it. And in fact, I'm only thrilled when I hear that. I'm thrilled when I hear it. Because the point to the book was to actually spark uncomfortable discussions. It was to spark a different way of thinking about this issue. It wasn't to claim to be an expert on clinical issues. It was simply meant to say we can do better in terms of the way we design our systems. That's it. So let's talk about some examples of it. I want to get some terminology out of the way for those of you who haven't read the book. When I talk client, and we're talking about a public service in this case, when I talk client, I mean that in two different ways, one of which is easy to understand because it's common, and that's the person who comes to the door and says, "Can you help me?" So that person, as an individual, is a client, and that's our traditional way of thinking about it. And the problem is that we have failed to grasp the point that in a public service, the client technically is the public. It's the whole tax-paying population. It's not only those who have enough self-awareness or enough family support to end up finding themselves at the door. It's not only those who are ill. Because if we call it a mental health system, and in fact our job is mental health, but our tradition is that it's a mental illness care system. It's misnamed. It's a mental illness care system. We don't actually provide support for healthy people to keep them healthy. We don't have the money or the staff or the expertise, in fact, because most people who are clinically trained are not trained to do basic support for healthy people. They're trained to assess, diagnose, and treat those who have illness, those who have abnormal symptoms. So we call it mental health, but yet what we've done is we've created this section of the public and called it the client. Just those who are ill and come to our door. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, but the just keep in mind that when I use the term client, I mean it at the individual level, but I also truly mean that the entire public is the client. Okay? Priority is another really important word. It's probably the most important word in the book. And it's probably the most important word to me when I think about these system issues. We misuse the word priority constantly. People use the word priority as if it means important, and it doesn't. It does not mean important. It means one thing comes prior to another. It's a term of relativity. It's not an absolute term. You can't say these things are our priorities. That's a misuse of the word. Because unless you're attaching a number 1 and a number 2 and a number 3 to those things in terms of an order of importance, then you might as well just use the word important and say these are the important things to us. But if you're going to use the word priority, you better attach numbers because you're actually saying one thing comes prior to another. Now this is significant because when we use terms like client-centered or patient-centered, when we use that kind of term, we are implying priority when we say that. We're just not using the word. So for instance, on Valentine's Day, I'm sure many of you got down on your knees and said to some loved one, you are the one, and I don't need to have to find courage to do it a second time. And I don't ever have to have somebody tell me I got the wrong place. Does this make sense to you? So in the context of mental health and addiction work, something like the single access point is not the same as it is in any other service. It's different, but we have not really considered that. But in a client-centered administrative approach and a client-centered system, we consider the actual nature of the client. And we consider what are the important things to this type of person, the person with this type of need. So, I mean, if I suffer from depression, but I do, I live with depression, so I understand this one more than the others, but with depression, if I have to call a number and I'm taking a risk that somebody's going to tell me I got the wrong number, I'll tell you what that does. That's just another rejection. And in fact, I'm living with this constant feeling of no value, no worth, and I have somebody else just rejected me on the phone by telling me I called the wrong place. So clearly I'm also stupid and incompetent, and these people don't want to help me. Great. Thanks for proving it for me. I already knew it, but thanks for proving it for me. But any other, a day surgery in a hospital, no big deal. You reject me and tell me another number to call, no problem. It doesn't change the nature of my biological illness. But a client-centered system has to focus specifically through the eyes of these clients. What is their experience? How do they feel about something we consider to be not that big a deal in most systems? So, if we start from the beginning, this is what we did in South Shore of Nova Scotia. We started with the idea that if somebody discovers that or decides that he or she wants to get help, okay, what happens next? So we took this sort of tracing method, and worked our way through the client experience and took each component of the system one piece at a time. And so the first part would be, well, how do they find us? And we discovered we had 3 phone numbers in this tiny little district. And so it was really simple. We should have more, we should have one. It should be really simple. And we should figure out how to make those calls bounce to the right places or how to have one person transfer calls. That's our problem. The client doesn't need to see that. So anybody like going to theater, live plays and stuff? Do you know that, probably 90% of all the work, tell them I said hi. 90%, but I'm not going on the call if it's something that's dangerous. 90% of the work, I did theater for years as a younger person, about 92 years ago. But 90% of the work happens behind the curtain. The client doesn't see it. The client doesn't see the set changes. The client doesn't see the costume changes. The client doesn't see any of that stuff. The client is the audience member. Well, that's the way we need to function. The client doesn't need to know all the hassles and inconveniences, doesn't need to be part of that. It's just thanks for calling, I'm going to make sure you get the right person, not here's another phone number. Because that's showing them the set change, right? You know, you've got to make it so that it's an enjoyable, a comfortable kind of experience for them by not showing them the behind-the-scenes stuff. It's deciding what stuff is for them and what stuff is for us behind the curtains. So as we started to talk about how do we make a client-centered system, you know, we did the single phone number thing, and then we started talking about, okay, well, so once the person calls and gets somebody on the phone, what happens next? Like what is it about that part now that we can do to make it client-centered? And people would start to generate what I refer to as, hypothetical and even theoretical kinds of answers. There were intellectual kinds of answers. Like, well, client-centered, would be that it would work this way, it would work that way. They'd come up with examples, and it never felt real enough for me as we were talking, sitting with this leadership team, and it never felt real enough. And so I found myself shifting and saying, okay, stop for a second. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to pretend right now, seriously, go into your own mind and pretend that the client is your mother. Pretend the client is your son, your brother, your wife. Pick one. Now, go there in your head. Now tell me, what do you want to happen when he or she calls that number? How do you want that next piece to work for your wife, for your daughter? Now, when I just said that to you, I know that you just felt a shift in the way you were thinking about any kind of system, right? So if I say to you, what does a client-centered intake system look like? You give me one kind of answer. But if I say, how do you want intake to work for your daughter or your father, it's a different answer. And I intentionally did not say, I want you to pretend you're the client and tell me how it should work. Because we can dismiss stuff and tolerate stuff. So if somebody asked me, well, Todd, what's a reasonable, if you were the client, what would be a reasonable wait time for an appointment? Well, I'm a patient kind of guy. So I could say, well, unless I'm in a real crisis at the moment, I'd be okay with a couple months. That's probably reasonable. And, I think of that in the context of the many months that lots of areas have. I think, well, I could live with 2 months. But if you asked me about my son, it's tomorrow. It's tomorrow. The word months should never be used if it's my son, if it's my wife. Sorry, there should be access now. Because it becomes just this absolute, unforgivable, black and white kind of issue for me in that case. So that's what I started to use with the leadership team, because it brought everybody to a point of reality that we had not been at before. It anchored us to something that I felt was the true definition of client-centered. I think the answer to that question, how would you want this part of the system to work if the client was your mother, father, brother, sister, etc.? The answer to that is the definition of client-centered. That's how to find it. If you use that question to anchor all your discussions, I guarantee you will end up with some of the most responsive decisions that you've ever come up with. Because it's so personal and real. So people would start to generate really great ideas then that were very different, very personal, very experiential. And they'd start to say these things, but then I'd start to hear what I call the yeah buts. So people would start to say, yeah, but that's a good idea. But if we do that, Mary is going to have 2 more hours of paperwork every day. And yeah, but the union's not going to like us scheduling staff that way because that's not the way it's usually been done. There's an estoppel issue there. It's common practice. And yeah, but George, he's not working evenings to see clients. No way. He's going to fight this. Right? So there's all the yeah buts, and there are tons of them, and they're all good yeah buts. I'm not criticizing. Everybody's got good yeah buts. My answer to it, though, that came out the very first time instinctively became the title of the book, and it's not about us. All those yeah buts are actually about us. But yeah, but I, this, yeah, but George, yeah, but Mary, yeah, but the Minister of Health, yeah, but the Finance Director. That's us. It's not about us. The program does not exist to meet our needs. It does not exist to give us convenience. It does not exist to make us happy. It does not exist to make us satisfied in our jobs, to make us want to go to work. That is not why it exists. It's nice if we can achieve some of those in the process, but sorry, it isn't for that purpose. That's just a bonus if we can do it. It exists for only one actual purpose, and that is to serve the public within this specialty kind of area, to create and maintain and recover mental health. This is the client only. We are paid to have a pain in the ass. We are paid to be inconvenienced. We are paid to do things we don't want to do. We don't get to choose that stuff. It's called a job. But yet, in our discussions, the yeah buts end up taking a lot of decisions, taking them over. If you were hiring somebody to paint your house inside, paint your living room, and you handed them a swatch and said, "This is the color I want," and you went to work and the person was there painting, you came back and the walls were a different color. How'd you feel about that? What's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with it is that that painter failed to recognize that it's not about what he or she likes. He or she is paid to meet my needs and put that fuchsia on my wall, even though it's as ugly as crap. It doesn't matter. It is not about him and what he thinks is beautiful. Same concept. And you would not tolerate that if you were the client hiring that painter. You would simply say, "It's not about you. I don't care what you like. Shut up and paint." You might not say it that way. You only would say it that way if it's a family member. That's what family is for. So this is where this kind of came from, this concept, this idea. And as we went through, working our way through the various parts of the system, we discovered just a million tiny little things that we had never really considered to be big issues for clients. And it's only because we started analyzing it this way, from that perspective of if it was my son or whoever, it gave us these different answers. And so tiny things like, so when my mother calls that number and gets up the courage to do it, and can barely even speak on the phone because of her anxiety or she's crying, or when she makes that call, who should be answering the phone? Well, I'll tell you who does answer the phone. It's the people that they've hired based on two primary criteria, one being union seniority, and two being technical skills like data entry, computer use. Am I right? And that's what those are the main competency we think of is you're able to wear a headset and function really quickly and easily in entering data as somebody tells you their name and their health card number and all that stuff. Okay. Is that what the client needs? Competent data entry? If it was your sister, would you say, "Oh God, I hope when she calls she gets a competent data entry person"? I hope that person knows how to wear a headset. No. The only thing you would give a shit about is, does she hear warmth on the phone? Does she hear compassion on the phone and empathy? Can you hear that when you call somebody? Can you tell when you've gotten somebody on the other end of the phone somebody who does give a shit and somebody who doesn't give a shit? You know the difference? How long does it take you to feel the difference? Yeah. The first 5 words out of that person's mouth, you absolutely feel whether there is empathy and compassion or whether this is a technician who happens to have to talk to you. So a client-centered system would find a way to work around all that other crap and hire based on personality. Hire based on compassion and empathy and warmth. Hire somebody who's going to sound like they care about me when I call, so that I immediately start to relax. My anxiety drops very quickly. My depression starts to kind of get out of my way enough to talk because this person is making me feel good, making me feel okay about myself by saying, "I'm so glad you called. You know, so yeah, how can we help you? It's such a different experience for people. So how do we do that? Because we're still stuck with seniority lists. Unions don't like when we play with those things, right? It's going to be a grievance, somebody else will end up with the job, you know, and it'll be the one that's the best survivor in the system. You know, the one who's managed to use the union for 20 years to stay in the job, despite the fact that everyone knows he or she should never have been in it. That's the stuff that happens. And I don't mean all the time, but you know, put up your hand if you've seen that kind of thing happen. It's the wrong person in the wrong job, but the union is the reason the person is still there, right? Because that's where the safety is. And I'm not bashing unions, that's not the issue. They serve a great purpose. This isn't one of those. This isn't one of those. So find ways around it. Be creative about how you create the job description. Really put time into that. Spend days figuring out the job description. So you can put in measurable, observable criteria that somebody with a shitty personality can't pass. I mean, how do you demonstrate that? Because it's about demonstrated competencies. That's what we look for. That's the current language. It's behavior-based interviewing. It's that kind of stuff. How do you do that? Figure it out. You know, we're all coming from backgrounds that involve anything from nursing to social work to psychology to psychiatry. I'm pretty sure we're able to come up with a few words that actually describe observable, measurable personality characteristics and behaviors that help us screen out the crap and get the warm person on the phone. But how much time do we put into that? Typically not too much. And often that's because we're scared we're going to fail and get a grievance. You know, many people in administration, they become really averse to doing anything that might bring about a grievance. There's no reason to be scared of a grievance. A grievance is actually a statement by the union that a collective agreement has been violated. That's all it is. So, win. That's it. Design it so that you'll end up winning the grievance. Don't design it so that you'll avoid getting a grievance, because if you do, you're going to hire crap. You're going to have cold people on the phone, you're going to have terrible therapists, you're going to have all that stuff. If your avoidance of a grievance is the issue, it should be avoidance of a losing grievance. That means do the work in advance, so that you're hiring the right kind of person for the right kind of job, but you're doing it in a way that is tight. And yeah, somebody might hate it. The one with the most seniority is going to hate it and going to grieve it. It's fine. But if you've done it right and put the days that it takes to really meticulously build it, you'll win it and you'll get a client-centered reception for the clients. So the same thing applies to the person on the front desk when somebody walks in. Exact same thing. On the phone, in person, exact same thing. You walk into any business, any public service, you know if this person gives a crap about you or not. And you know it immediately. You know if you've got a technician or a person. And so if I don't feel welcome, then the whole time in the waiting room is going to be a significant problem for me, because you haven't made it feel like a comfortable place. Which is a nice segue to the concept of a waiting room. Why do we call it a waiting room? Because its job, its intention, in fact, our plan, is for you to wait. Otherwise, we wouldn't call it a waiting room. We'd call it a walk-through room, which normally is referred to as a hallway. But we wouldn't call it a waiting room. If we're naming it a waiting room, that means we know, and therefore intend, for people to wait when they arrive. That doesn't sound like what I would want from my wife. Why would I want intentionally for her to wait? Who's that for? Who does it serve? Well, it serves maybe the clinician who is finishing up case notes from the previous client, or is in a meeting, some kind of meeting on site, or something like that. It serves their ability to be flexible and not have to stop what they're doing. But it's not about us. So, if the client is the priority, and that means number one beside the name, right? And is the center, if we're going to use that terminology, that means if we make an agreement with a client, which is what an appointment actually is, it's an agreement. We're saying if you show up at 1 o'clock, you'll see you at 1 o'clock. That's what an appointment is. It's an agreement that both of you will actually meet in a room to talk at 1 o'clock, right? It's a mutual commitment. So if we make that agreement, and the person shows up, and I'm the clinician sitting in my office, and I'm finishing up my notes from the previous client, and I figure, whatever, it takes me an extra 5 or 10 minutes. It's not that big a deal. It's only 5 or 10 minutes. Okay. Again, let's go back to a comparison. If I'm going to an orthopedics clinic for my knees, 5 or 10 minutes sitting waiting does not make my arthritis worse. But what if my problem is social anxiety? And now what you're making me do is sit for 10 minutes, maybe it's a half hour, but let's just pretend it's nice and small. Somebody with social anxiety, we're making them sit in a public space with strangers for 10 minutes. It could be 3 minutes and it'll feel like an hour to that person. Or it might make that person leave. You may have seen that happen where people they just can't tolerate waiting because of the nature of their condition. It's different than other services. Waiting for even a few minutes isn't the same with this client. But do we design a different approach to it? Typically we don't. We allow flexibility because we take a few minutes here and a few minutes there. Everybody in healthcare is used to waiting. Right? Put up your hand if you don't wait at healthcare services of various kinds when you go yourself. Put up your hand, anybody? Somebody? Okay, excellent. I feel like I'm in Nova Scotia. It's perfect. So we are absolutely kindred spirits. So, we're used to it. In fact, we're so used to it that we don't even feel appalled by it anymore. We don't notice it. So if you've got an appointment with your family doctor or with any kind of clinic and it's for 2 o'clock, what do you tell your spouse or your family about when you'll be back? You don't tell them 2:30. Unless it's 2:30 the next day. Yeah. I'll be back by 4 or 5. Because it's every waiting for a while. It's just normal. It's normal. We're desensitized to it. And that's fine. It's not fine, but we have to accept that that's the way that is. But if my problem is depression, that means what I feel every day, every second, is that I have no value and nobody cares about me and there's no reason that they should, in fact. That's what I feel. And I show up for a 1 o'clock appointment, and even the person who's paid to care about my well-being or to pretend to care about my well-being isn't even pretending to care by coming out at the time that we agree. So even the therapist doesn't care enough to see me when we agree. I can't think of any reason to keep living if even that person doesn't care. That is the real experience. So this room that should be called a hallway, that's called a waiting room, is actually directly harmful to the actual conditions that we're supposed to be treating. It's not that it just allows it to get worse. Because there are lots of, most illnesses and psychological disorders, most of all kinds, are progressive in nature. So waiting actually causes them to, allows them to progress, to get worse. Most have that. But in this case, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about our system causing harm, not allowing harm. That's an ethics issue. That's not a time issue. That's not about progressiveness. That's an ethics issue. Because we are actually causing harm to the exact problem we're supposed to be treating. But we don't think about that because everybody's so used to those little tiny things like that, waiting 5 or 10 minutes or a half hour. It's no big deal because everybody does it. But in this program, that should never happen. One of the simplest and I believe most important decisions I made at all in our mental health program was to say to staff, and it was the most authoritarian decision I ever made. I simply said, as a directive, from now on, because we're saying the client comes first, if the client shows up on time, the client gets seen on time. That's a mandate now for everybody. I don't care what else you do. It's irrelevant because it's not number 1 on the list. Or say we're paperwork centered. We're saying we're client centered. So if you're changing case notes, you can do that later. And if you have that bad memory problem that you can't, you gotta go see occupational health. If you have a problem. So, you stop. When the receptionist calls you and says, Mary is here, you stop. You don't say, let her know I'll be open in a few minutes. You stop. And you walk out right then. If you're in a meeting, even if it's with the crotchety old boss, you walk out and you see the client on time. The only exception that I allowed in that case was if the client you have been seeing prior to this one that just arrived is in crisis in your office. Well, that's an obvious case of shifting priority. One client comes before the other client. The one that's in crisis, obviously, we manage the crisis. Because the one that's in the waiting room is not as bad, and even though it might get worse, you still deal with crisis. That's the only exception. And it was amazing because what I actually started to see after that was a hallway where there used to be a waiting room. There were empty chairs. There was almost never anybody sitting there. Because they'd arrive, they might get their ass in the seat for a few seconds, and then somebody would come and take them. So every time I walked through the waiting area, it was empty. That's pretty cool. Like, look at that. We just built a new hallway. It was really amazing. It's nice to have chairs in the hallway. We overlook the simple stuff, because we don't actually think about the micro level experiences of the client. We think as administrators. We think as clinicians. We believe we know what's best lots of the time. And we don't think about, we talk about empathy being such an important thing in this business, and it is at the clinical level, but it has not been at the administrative level. Administrators historically don't actually exercise empathy by seeing the world through the client's eyes, which is what empathy is. It's when you see someone else's perspective on something. So when we look at what we've done, I've said, we have a mental illness care system. That's primarily what it does, because we typically have had criteria, inclusion criteria, whether they're written or not, inclusion criteria. Somebody has to be ill enough in order to receive service from us, because we provide service for people who are ill. So that's what we do. So therefore, if you need something else that's not that serious, we don't have that for you. So many of our formal public services are like that. And the cutoff point is, it will vary from program to program. But a group of physicians in my area used to refer to the mental health program as a castle with a moat around it. Because trying to get somebody into that program, you had to find a way to storm the castle. And there was simply no way to do that. It was the hardest thing they ever did. So they simply got into the habit of putting down suicidal ideation on every referral form, whether it was true or not. Because from a liability perspective, the program couldn't ignore that, even if they knew this doctor was full of crap. They still couldn't ignore it. And that's what these doctors were forced to do. Now that's wrong. And I mean it's wrong for the doctors to do that, but I mean it more the other way. It's wrong that a system exists that causes someone to think that's the only way to do it. The only way to get somebody in. So what our system typically does in many areas is, because we have this unwritten inclusion criteria, that means we have exclusion criteria, and so you're not sick enough. So someone shows up maybe in an emergency department, in crisis, family is bringing them there. Person ends up getting assessed, doesn't meet the criteria for an inpatient admission, or doesn't meet the criteria for involuntary admission, or, there are real reasons for that, and we can't just be putting everybody in bed because that's the wrong treatment for some people, and wrong approach and all that. But people end up leaving because they don't meet the criteria. And so really what we're telling them is, wait. We're just not using that word, but we're really telling them to wait. And the beautiful thing is that waiting will actually help them meet the inclusion criteria. Right? They'll get sicker. We know that. There's no doubt. There's no way around that. If we send them away and they wait, or if they call and they're not sick enough for, or whatever, 6 months from now, this is not really all that high on the triage list, that's fine, so we're telling them to wait. By the time that 6 months comes up, they might not even need that outpatient appointment, which is good, it'll free up a slot. Because they'll be at the emergency department looking for Sarah to assess it. It's Sarah, right? Yeah. But they'll be at the emergency department looking for psychiatrists to do an assessment for admission. Because we have told them to wait, which is like a synonym for progress in their illness. Right? They will get worse. So it's great. The other really interesting thing from an administrative perspective is that we get to set the bar, and we get to set the bar as to where the criteria are. And so if for instance, in Nova Scotia, aside from the criteria, even around wait times, in Nova Scotia, the provincial standard for wait time for mental health is always 3 months. Okay? From a client perspective, how does that sound to you? If it's your son? Not very good, right? But that means that's the target. The system is going to try to make sure that everybody gets seen within 3 months. But if we wanted to reduce the wait lists, it's easy. Just change the standard, make it 5 months. And suddenly we have less demand on our system, right? Or change the criteria in terms of the triage. Make it so that you have to actually have a diagnosable disorder. If you don't meet DSM criteria, we don't see you. It's excellent. Talk about reducing demand and reducing wait times. It's a cinch. We get to control that as administrators and bureaucrats in departments. We can control that. And when an auditor general comes in and audits the program, they will conclude that we're meeting standards. Set the standards in a way that suits the system, not the clients. One of the things that, and I'll finish up with this before Claire tackles me, but one of the things that thrills me the most about this particular event is that the focus here is this issue of collaborative kind of work. How do we, the multiple disciplines and organizations and agencies of all different levels and types, how do we do better work together for the client? And the client, in my mind, is the public. That we is essential, but how you define it and how you operationalize it matters a lot. So how many of you have been at any kind of interagency committee? You've been a member of an interagency kind of working group or committee, maybe around youth mental health or something. Typically that's the one that gravitates everybody, pulls everyone together. You've been on one of those committees, and most of the time is spent sharing information with each other. Updates, telling you about programs. So put up your hand if you've been at one of those meetings. Fun? Keep your hand up if it was fun. Yeah. And put your hand up if you found it really productive and you saved kids' lives by those FYI meetings. Right. We've got dysfunction in the way we collaborate because it's not designed to be client-centered. The system around that table is not designed to be client-centered. So I come in representing mental health, and my job there is to see the world from the mental health system perspective. And my job is to draw a line, a circle in the sand around my program and say, this is my responsibility and everything else is somebody else's. And I'm not crossing that line. And so the police will say, well, God, can't you guys just, do this instead? Because you're making our lives miserable and keeping us from being able to do our job because you won't do this. You won't make it, that's probably sharing information. But so the police will say that, and we'll say, well, no, here's the line. We don't cross that line. And the police saying, well, this is our line, and the school system is saying, oh, God, we can't do that. Here's their circle. So we have a bunch of circles that never touch each other. And everybody's protecting their turf around the table. And when I'm sitting at the table, in fact, I'm thinking about the things that aren't working. And guess what? If I look at the list in my mind of all the things that are not working, they're all in your shit. Not mine. I'm not coming and thinking about all the things broken in my system. Why would I do that? Every single organization comes in thinking this is an opportunity to help them see the light. Right? If only those child protection people would change their policies on this. Right? If only we could get the police to do things this way. If only, the school board would, get out of their own way and start doing this the way we need it done. You've all experienced that, the laughter probably. Yeah, but it's so not funny. But yet it is when you look back at it. There are methods of creating healthy collaboration that actually get stuff done. One chapter in my book is specifically about that. In fact, I just recently created a workshop to train agencies on how to do this, how to apply this kind of model. My academic background is actually social psychology, which intergroup relations is a core function of. So that's why I came at it from this perspective. But anyway, and so I created this workshop, and pilot tested it in Newfoundland a few weeks ago. And so I will be starting to offer that. And Claire and I have talked about the possibility of actually doing that here at some point. And so, just throw that out there kind of as a thought. Because what we have to get to is the fact that the client is actually in the center. And all of our circles that we draw, they have to overlap. Not just touch. They have to overlap. You know what a Venn diagram is? The circles have to overlap. But you know why we don't like them to overlap? Because it means we're stepping into a gray area. And people say, well, oh yeah, if that's sort of their job and sort of our job, both, then who gets sued if something goes wrong? Right? So we get concerned with all that stuff. The gray is uncomfortable for administrators because you have to give up some control. You have to adopt some level of uncertainty. And I'll close with one example here of this. When we were building our school-based service, which it got national television attention and everything, really great partnership. And when we were building it, I said to the schools, tell me what the kids need. What is it? What are the issues they need? It was really simple. It was sex, drugs, and mental health. That's it, those three. Okay, well, our program provided two of those. Not the sex part. Mental health and addictions doesn't have a mandate to do sexual health issues, sexual health counseling. So we could have said, well, that's not in our circle. So, we'll talk to public health or somebody else about that and have them do that part. We could have done that and created a situation where we were making the client fit our siloed system. Or we could have done a client-centered thing and said, well, forget about the silos. If we've got counselors going into the schools, I'm pretty sure we can pretty quickly train them to know a little bit of sexual health. Since most of them probably have had sex a few times, might actually know something. This is a half-day workshop for the very basics, right? And so that's what we did, and it wasn't our job. It was far outside of our circle. Far outside of our circle, but it's what the clients needed. So we adapted the structure and the system to meet the client's needs, not expect the client to fit our structure. And it was one of the most exciting things we did just because I love that. I love breaking those rules. I love stepping over those lines and into someone else's turf, by agreement and saying, well, this is what's best for the client, so let's do it. So as all of you work ahead on these kinds of issues, I'm just, as I said, and I've posted this a few times in the last couple of days, I am so thrilled and honored that you brought me here for this, because what I sensed from the beginning, from my first conversations with Claire and others on phone calls, what I sensed from the beginning was that there's a genuine passion here, a genuine interest in different, not more of the same. And one of the phrases I've been using a lot lately is more of the same doesn't give us different. The public is not looking for more of the same. Some of them think they need that. But if the system isn't really working well, why would you want more of that same system? We got federal money coming down. Let's do different. Let's not do just more of the same stuff that's not really doing the job. And no offense to those who are working in the system, but the system needs to be shifted. And those of you working in the system, in any component of it, need to constantly remember it's not about us.